and this edition of Consumer Compass looks at the most vulnerable people in our community. Here at Consumer Protection, we spend a lot of time investigating claims from seniors who've been defrauded.
Sees this, he's going to be more than very unhappy.
You know, many of these scams are avoidable, so we try to educate the community any way we can. One way is by holding public forums and meetings at senior centers. Here's one we did recently at the Charter House in Silver Spring with lots of good advice.
I'm Stuart Rosenthal, publisher of the Beacon newspapers and chair of the Maryland Commission on Aging, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's program. Thank you for coming.
The law, like 500 or 1,000 years ago, invented the concept of a power of attorney, which is that if I cannot manage my own finances or make my own healthcare decisions, I can give my authority to somebody else on a temporary or permanent basis. The Maryland law has now passed just this past October. We have a new model statutory form that is the standard, and the good news about that is that all banks and financial institutions, Merrill Lynch and all those other kinds of houses, all have to recognize this model statutory form. It can be tinkered with a little bit. It has to have the magic witness requirements have got to be met on that form. But the good news is once you do that, the banks and other places have to recognize them. We used to, before this law went into effect, we would draft, as attorneys, we would draft financial powers of attorney, and sometimes the banks would say, we don't recognize this, or this isn't our form, and we don't know what to do with it. So I'm a general supporter of the new law. There are a few little imperfections, but that's true of just about everything in the world. So generally, the new statutory power of attorney form is a very helpful requirement.
If you would want or need assisted living, know that in Maryland, assisted living facilities are licensed. That's not the case in every state. But in Maryland, you have the protection that your assisted living facilities are licensed. Now, there are some people who have small homes that provide care that are operating fraudulently, and they're not licensed. So the first thing you always want to ask when you're looking for care, is your facility licensed? Also, you should ask, can I see your inspection reports? Whether it's assisted living or nursing homes, these facilities are inspected by the state of Maryland, and you have the right, all of the public has the right to see these reports. You should also always visit the facilities before you make a decision about moving there. What might be good for one of you might not be something enjoyable for the other person. But don't visit at the same time every day. Make multiple visits. Go at lunchtime. Stop by in the evening. Go on the weekend and see how many staff are there. And the number of staff and how the staff treat the residents is the very number one thing.
The main types of perpetrators that pick on seniors are what I would call this category of trusted people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the other category would be strangers. And I think Eric's going to talk more about how some of the strangers come at you. But strangers are often the ones that are committing identity fraud. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that piece. There's good and bad news about identity fraud. Almost all of you in this room at some point in your life are going to be a victim of identity fraud or have been a victim of identity fraud. It is incredibly common. That's the bad news about it. And the bad news, related even to the bad news, is much of it that goes on involving your credit cards is done through the internet or through online sources coming out of Eastern Europe or coming out of other foreign countries where the ability for us locally here to prosecute really doesn't exist. None of you want to pay the taxes for me to fly to Russia and find a bad guy and bring him back here. The good news about this, though, is identity fraud has changed over the years. When it first became a problem, the banks were very much telling us as consumers, your problem, you sort it out. And that's changed. The banks have realized we need to keep you as customers, and so for the vast majority of identity fraud cases, the customers do not wind up suffering any financial loss. I think a statistic I saw not too long ago was over 75% of the people that have been victims of identity fraud don't have any financial loss. Headache, yes, you're going to have headache as you try to sort these things out, but no real financial loss to you.
And, the thing is, crooks are the great equalizer. They don't care if you're rich or poor, whether you have lots of degrees or whether you don't have much of a formal education. If they can rip you off, they will. And the most amazing thing is the people who've been scammed that contact our office will say, I can't tell you how many times they say this, but he sounded so honest. He was so convincing. He sounded so nice. Yeah, exactly. Because if he didn't, he'd have to have real jobs like the rest of us. So the only way these scams work is if they can bring you into their trust. And they're professional at doing what they're doing. I want to tell you about the latest scam, fake checks. I don't know if people have already experienced that, have already seen them. And this proves, fake checks proves that old scams never die. They just go high tech. The crooks, the fraudsters, the conmen have been able to create checks that look so real, even a bank teller cannot distinguish them from a real check. And this also proves to what extent we've done something of a good job of educating consumers. So a lot of consumers will not fall for some of the scams. So we've raised the bar. They now have to trick you by delivering to you a fake check. So we all know, we're smart enough to know that if someone tells us we've won $1 million in the lottery, don't believe it. But so now the crooks send us what they claim is a real check for our first payment, because to prove to us that we've really won this lottery. And all we have to do is send them a check for $200 to pay for the taxes or the administrative fees or whatever, and then they'll keep sending us more and more checks. Well, of course, as you know, the end of that story, you send the check to them, it's a good check, and then you go and 7 days later you find out the check that you deposited is in fact a phony check. But these checks, these fake checks, are so real, they have security features on them, they have watermarks on them, you cannot distinguish them. So we just again have to realize that these scams have gone high-tech, and don't be fooled by them.
And we all find ourselves in situations where we think we're smart. I think I'm a smart consumer. But little did I know how much of this kind of scam goes on. And people who work hard for their money every day like we all do have to be very careful. So I'm really happy that the Office of Consumer Protection has decided to come out here to the Charter House to do all that they can to impart information to us. And so every time I am in the company of this, of Eric and his folks, I just have to say thank you for teaching me. There's so much to learn.